morning, everybody. My name is Matt Cook, and I'm the director of the Center for Healthy Churches. I'd like to welcome you to Changing Church webinar. This webinar is designed to help ask and answer good questions to help ministers and congregations do good, adaptive spiritual work in the midst of everything that we deal with in this context of ministry in the 21st century. We have a number of organizations that help us make this webinar a reality, which I'm very grateful for their partnership. We're very grateful for the good partnership of New Matrix, and I think I saw Deborah Wright, who joined us just a moment ago, for the Church Network, for Truett Seminary and the Truett Church Network, for Gardner Webb Divinity School, for Baptist News Global, for the Presbyterian Foundation, and for the Lake Institute for Faith and Giving, all of whom helped make this webinar a reality. So grateful for their friendship and their partnership. So this morning, we are finishing up a series called How to Put Your Foot on the Gas When the Tank is Empty. For the last few weeks, we have been asking and answering the question related to the experience of a lot of ministers as they emerged from the pandemic. Nobody came out of the pandemic saying, woohoo, best 2 years of my life, can we get more of that? No one's really had that experience. Although I will say that my good friend Jayne Davis, who is our presenter today, did tell me at one point that she was built for working from home all the time. So God created her for this exact moment. But I think even Jayne would tell you that there were challenges and difficulties that went from social isolation and from social distancing, rather. But Jayne Davis is associate pastor at First Baptist Church of Wilmington, North Carolina, works closely with the area of discipleship and spiritual formation there. And so I'm assuming that's what the well that she will be drawn from this morning. So Jayne, it is great to have you and for you to answer the question, how do you go about dealing with the challenge of carrying with us all the challenges of what we've lived with, but also trying as best we can to be faithful and help the congregations that we are serving by pouring energy and life into them. So Jayne, welcome. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Matt. I really am grateful to be a part of this group and this conversation. It has been wonderful. Guy, thank you for your words a couple of weeks ago. And it's a important topic. When Matt called me to talk about this webinar series, I had just come out of a staff meeting where everyone was sharing how they were gearing up for the fall, and there was a lot of energy. And it was our first big season of ministry on this side of COVID, and everybody was just kind of ready to go. And I had led the devotion that morning, and my devotion was about paying attention to the spiritual rhythm in our lives in the midst of all of this bustle and activity. Because we all know that once the floodgates open, life becomes crazy. And it's really hard to establish a routine of rest and self-care and prayer if we don't have it already. The pace of life just kind of feeds on itself. And if we're not careful, we end up planning and doing only out of our own strength and our own wisdom and our own capacity, all of which we know are finite and limited. That we need a rhythm of grace that gives space for our relationship with God, to be reminded that we are not what we do, and a place in our schedule to rest in the truth that we are loved and accepted as we are, and space for our ability to hear God and to change course if necessary, to not just be carried away by momentum, but to notice the holy moments that we are in. A rhythm that allows our ministries to be a response to what God is doing, who and how God's calling us to be. And so I finished my devotion, and a peace and a quiet just kind of fell over the room as if we were taking this deep collective breath and pondering silently what that might mean for each of us. And as soon as we were done, our pastor responded. He said, pay attention to this, because the train is leaving the station right now, and it's going to be 100 miles an hour from now until Christmas. And this was how we ended our time. And it just reminds me that we all live in the tension of putting our foot on the gas and trying to keep our tank from becoming empty. But the irony for me is that the day of that staff meeting, it had not been very long since I had returned from sabbatical, where I had wrestled with these very challenges of rhythm, balance. A few years ago, Matt and I were on a mission trip in South Africa, and the local pastor told our team a story, which I've actually heard in other places since then, but it was about a missionary around the turn of the century who was traveling through the jungle and anxious to get to his new post and begin the work to which God had called him. The two local tribesmen were traveling with him as guides, helping to navigate the unfamiliar and the dangerous terrain. And the third man was there as an interpreter. And because he was so determined to get where he was going as quickly as possible, the missionary just pushed the team to travel at a relentless pace for days. Until one morning, the two guides sat down and just refused to move. And the missionary tried to prod them along to convey the urgency of his work and of getting to where they were going, but still they refused. And finally, he asked the translator to find out why they wouldn't. And one of the men replied, "We must sit here and wait for our spirits to catch up to our bodies." Have you ever felt that way? When your body and your work and your ministry has gotten way ahead of you, taken on a life of its own, your spirit is longing for rest, to breathe deep. That's how I was feeling about going into my spirit. What I was longing for my spirit to catch up to my body. Because sometimes momentum and routine in our life just carries us along. And the pace feeds on itself and we stop and
I'm
think,
listening to a webinar.
I don't even know how we got here. And we get ahead of ourselves. So the focus of my sabbatical, to let my spirit catch up with my body. And my theme was walking. It's Jesus' call to each of us, and it was my prayer for this. I wanted to walk at God's pace and not my own. There's a great book called The 3 Mile an Hour God. 3 miles an hour is apparently the average pace that a person walks. And so the author contends that 3 miles an hour is the speed of love, because it is the pace of God walking the same. And I wanted to walk at God's pace and rediscover God's rhythm in my life and ministry. So walking anchored my sabbatical, particularly a week-long 100-kilometer walk on the last section of the CBFNC, which is an ancient pilgrimage route from Canterbury, England to St. Peter's Square. We also did a section hike at the Appalachian Trail. I walked labyrinths of all shapes and sizes. I walked around medieval towns and across ancient bridges and ruins and urban parks with crowds of people and forests and hazelnut roads without a soul around. I even managed to accidentally walk my way into a protest march across the Brooklyn Bridge, which was actually a lot of fun. I chose walking for my sabbatical because walking as a spiritual practice helps me to empty and let go of all the things that clutter my mind and my heart and my life. Physically, mentally, spiritually, walking opens up space in the normal routine where I can encounter God and be refilled with hope and discovery, and imagination, clarity, and strength. Because I think when you walk intentionally and mindfully, you just see things differently. You'll see things you don't even ever see typically. You move more slowly, more deliberately. You notice your surroundings. And your thoughts have a chance to wander if you let them. And somehow in that freedom of wandering, they land exactly where you didn't know you needed them. In walking, you remember that you're a small part of something much bigger. Something you don't get to control, but you get to experience and enjoy. The anchoring grace that God is God. I think you gain a knowing in your body of God's presence, a sense of what incarnation is all about. Walking at the speed of love. It was a month into my sabbatical before the thoughts in my head began to detangle and fall away and create space in my mind for something new and fresh and free. And it wasn't just me trying harder to think. It was a month before I stopped waking up at night in a panic that something had fallen through the cracks or needed to be done. People or projects that needed tending. It was a month into my sabbatical before I genuinely felt at rest. How often do you feel at rest? Not just not tired, but at rest. The greatest lesson of my sabbatical is how desperately we need to stop. How desperately we need healthy rhythms in our lives. Because God has wired us for the rhythm of breathing in and breathing out, of sleeping and waking, of creation and Sabbath, of work and rest. Instead, we go and go and go, but we rarely stop. The word Sabbath literally means to stop. It's like we're always inhaling, but never exhaling. Like there's always noise, but never silence. Mozart said it's the silence between the notes that makes it music. Without punctuation or pausing, like it's just a run-on sentence. You need to learn to stop, and to be still, regularly. I'm convinced that if I had been practicing a better Sabbath rhythm in my life before Sabbath, it would not have taken a month for me to learn how to breathe, and breathe. And most of us just don't get the luxury of a month to figure that out. And I haven't yet made my way to incorporating a full 24-hour Sabbath practice into my life, but there are some Sabbath rhythms I've learned along the way that I think can be helpful in this moment as we are putting our foot on the gas and trying to keep our tank moving. And some of them are daily and some of them are weekly, and you all probably have practices of your own, and this is not at all a call to do more. Less is more in this case, really. But it is about being intentional in creating a consistent rhythm of rest in your life. And I would say that my number one practice would be centering. Centering prayer has pretty much saved my emotional and spiritual life. Whether it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes of sitting silently before God. You know, for those who like to get things done, centering prayer can feel like a colossal waste of time. I get that. Nothing happens. And that's exactly the point. Centering prayer is a reminder that we come before God with nothing. That we are welcomed and received because of who God is, because of who we are to God, not because of what we do or don't do, not with any eloquent prayer on our own. We are the beloved of God, made in God's image. That is our identity. That is the most important thing about us. And that's what will be true at the end of each day, no matter what goes well or what goes bad. The centering prayer is a discipline of embodying what is true, but what we often choose to forget. That we are empty before God, and we are loved beyond our ability to comprehend. Another practice is the daily office of praying the hours. One of the highlights of my sabbatical was returning to St. John's Abbey in Minnesota for a week, praying the liturgy with the Benedictine community. If I'm honest, I would have never thought that going to church 4 times a day for a week would be a highlight of my sabbatical, but it was exactly what I needed. Because when the Abbey bells ring, the community is called to pray. It's a deep reminder to me that I am called to order my life around God, not squeeze God into the chaos of my life. And I know most of us don't live or work in communities where physically praying the hours with others is a practice. But there's an app that I use. It's called Common Prayer, Liturgy for Ordinary Life. Maybe you've gotten the book. It's a take on the Book of Common Prayer written by Shane Claiborne and Jonathan Wilson. And the app sends notifications to me for morning prayer and midday prayer, evening prayer, and opens to the appropriate liturgy. And I'll admit, as much as praying the hours is a part of my desired Sabbath rhythm, I am still surprised most days when the notification comes. Because life is busy and crazy. And we need help with the rhythms we so desire. So this app helps me to remember what is most important. Order my life around God, no matter what is happening. Another practice is one I call the 5-minute sabbatical. You can call it daily office light if you want, but it still functions well as a reminder of ordering my life. For a few years, I set my watch alarm to go off at noon. And when it would go off, I would stop whatever I was doing to the extent that was possible, or do it very soon thereafter, and just sit in stillness and silence for 5 minutes. I would also set the timer on my watch for 5 minutes because I have found that I grossly overestimate how much time has passed when I'm sitting in silence. So this would keep me sitting there for 5 minutes. And I would sit in silence and just be received by God in the middle of a busy day at the same time. And some days I would use that moment for an examine of my morning and thank God for what had come my way. Confess what I like to have done differently, and pray maybe for God's guidance and direction for whatever was coming up. It's such a simple thing, but the 5-minute sabbatical was a way for me of remembering whose day this really is, and whose business I'm really trying to give out, and whose wisdom, strength, and direction I need most. And these Sabbath rhythms, they're not focused on study or learning or even interceding for others. It's about intentionally stopping and resting and being regular with intention and with humility. Which is, I think, what is most difficult when life just takes us, sweeps us up in its movement. Harder to find that we can. And with weekly rhythms, several of colleagues have already talked about Sabbath, and there are wonderful resources available about practicing a traditional Sabbath. And I truly long to work my way more fully in that direction. Because for all of my Orthodox Jewish friends who have never known a time without Sabbath, without stopping every Friday at sundown, I will tell you that Sabbath is an absolute gift of life and community, trust, rest. One resource that I liked a lot is from Practicing the Way, the wonderful spiritual formation. And you can find their Sabbath practice material at Practicing the Way. And I know that the practice of a full day Sabbath can feel overwhelming for out of reach, and I am there. And I'm always a believer in telling people to pray with what they have, not with what they have. Really, this is about a rhythm, a regularity. Better to consistently stop and rest and delight for a couple of hours one day a week than to try to take a day every day. To do what you can and not fret over what you can. And given my sabbatical journey, I would also commend to you a spiritual practice. Walk around your neighborhood, walk around your sanctuary, walk around your church. Walk intentionally, not just to get them, but as a discipline to go slow, to notice more, and to enjoy what God has created, to walk at the speed of love. Because we all have a rhythm to our life, intentionally or unintentionally. And some rhythms bring life, and some rhythms drain. So the question really is, what do we want rhythm? Other great lesson of sabbatical for me is that life is always lived in tension between us. And I think in paying attention to some of these, they can help us to recognize in real time whether the rhythm and pace of our lives need some adjustment. One tension is that of being busy versus being full. How many of you, when asked, how are you doing, answer, I'm really busy? I was challenged once when I gave that answer, I'm really busy with, but is your life full? Because being busy isn't bad if it's accomplishing something, if it's taking us somewhere that we long to go, if it's bringing meaning to our day, to our life. Is your life full? We all know what busy calendars feel like, what work versus busy work feels like. My daughter's an unpaid intern. She complains a lot about busy work, stuff that keeps us moving but doesn't really seem to matter. How much of our work is busy work? How much of our life is full? There will always be some measure of busyness. Are we paying attention? Moving in the direction of into abundance. Another tension I found was emptying out versus filling up. If you've ever had to say, I won't buy one more pair of shoes or one more whatever until I get rid of a pair because the closet is full of shoes that you haven't worn in years, this tension fits into that. Emptying out versus filling. If any of you have ever struggled with asthma, you know that mystery of breathing in but struggling to breathe back out. Struggling. And it makes no sense to me how it's possible to inhale deeply and barely exhale. Where does all the air go? Which fills little by little until we're suffocating on the very thing. You know, whether it's holding on to activities or programs or ideas or stuff, we never let go of if we never exhale, we will on the very things that bring us. And we'll never create space for God to do anything. On my sabbatical, I found the tension of savoring versus consuming. I will confess, I ate my way through sabbatical. And the truth is, we consume a lot of things. We consume experiences and relationships and food and doing and taking. Consume it and just move on to the next thing. Jeannie and I did a Bible study several years ago on savoring each, whatever it holds. It's a gift of the present moment, a gift that we too often take for granted. People, opportunities. Our church, are you savoring those? Are you consuming? There's the tension of the holy and the ordinary. You know, sometimes the holy and the ordinary are not as we would expect. I tried to create holy moments on my side, to orchestrate them somehow, to make it special. I visited dozens and dozens of churches, and they were all beautiful and moving in very different ways. Ornate, simple, crowded, empty. I was at St. Bart's in New York City, and there was scaffolding and workmen hammering away inside the sanctuary as I sat there trying to pray. And I tried to reflect theologically, you know, but we're all under construction, and they're all holy works in progress, but it was really a stretch in that moment that I so wanted to feel holy. And yet one of the holiest moments for me on my sabbatical was standing in line outside of a pharmacy in a small rural town along the Via Francigena. And no one spoke English, and we were desperately in need of things for our food. And my Italian is but I overheard a woman who had been looking at Wes and I turn to her friend and tell her we're going to. And there was just something about how she said it that just opened my soul. Because we were in pain in that particular moment. But we were going to Papa. Papa. The words were so simple, but they renewed. The tension is to be open, to be expectant, because we don't always know what moment to be holding and which one will simply be holding. It was also on the day that I thought about the tension between being alone and together. Because for 66 miles, my husband and I walked as pilgrims through medieval towns, through parks where wild boar and horses and sheep roam free. And I discovered that people make pilgrimages for all different reasons. Some are hoping to dream and and some are seeking discernment, some just want to clear their head and test their limits. The Via is not as popular as the Camino in Spain, but there were a handful of folks that we were kind of on a similar schedule with. So we would bump into them along the way. And we kept running into this retired professor from New Hampshire. He had started in Switzerland 2 weeks before we got on the ship. And it was just so encouraging to see people you recognize when you're walking along. And to have support, and to hear their stories, and to get to tell your own, and to share a similar experience with all of the adventure and challenges that it can be. And I thought, a lot of church is being alone together. There's soul work that only we can do for ourselves, but how much better when we do it alone together. When we encourage one another and share our stories along the way. It's the balancing of the individual and the group. Balance of solitude. And finally, the tension of awe and familiarity. The guest house at St. John's Abbey has a wall of windows on one entire side of the building that overlooks the lake and the forest that surrounds the lake, and it is spectacular. Whether I was walking through the front door of the guest house or into my room, it simply took my breath away every single time. And I mentioned this to Father Cyril, who runs the guest house, and he agreed that it was beautiful. But he also confessed, some days I just come in to work, and I don't know. I kept thinking God is making all things new all around us, but some days we just come in to work. And that routine can breed familiarity and miss the awe of what's right in front of us. How we see our people, our church, our community. When and where you experience. Busy or full, emptying out or filling up, savoring, consuming, holy or ordinary, alone or together, all familiar. I really believe if we pay attention to these tensions, if we pay attention to these tensions as we put our foot on the gas, they'll help us know whether the rhythm of our life is moving too fast. If we're putting our foot down too hard on the pedal, or if our tank is running low. I wanted to share my thoughts coming out of Sabbatical. I hope they add something to your own journey of figuring this post-COVID ministry world out. What speed are we to go? I pray whatever speed it is, and in some ways, in all ways, that it is the speed of love and the speed of God. Thank you for letting me share today. Appreciate it.
All right, Jayne, I have a couple of questions to kind of get us started. I would invite everybody that wants to use the chat feature to ask additional questions. So, you gave voice to the fact that it wouldn't have taken you a month to get into a different posture if you had a better rhythm before. And so if that's part of, I doubt anybody would push back on that. That there's probably no one on this Zoom meeting today that is so productivity oriented or so slavishly dedicated to always going 100 miles an hour that they wouldn't recognize the need for it. The challenge for lots of people, even lots of people in ministry who have gone to seminary and had conversations about this and have read books about it, it seems to be, how do you begin to incorporate? How do you begin to take those steps? So my question for you is, what would you suggest for people that are just getting started? Is there one of the practices that you think gives it more readily to begin to incorporating this mindset and this rhythm? Or if there's not one practice, what advice would you give for helping everyone listening discern which of those practices would be the best fit for them?
I mean, I think like a lot of habits that we want to incorporate into our life, the best thing I can say is just do something. Start with something. So of the habits or the practices that I talked about, really centering prayer has been the most significant for me. Now, I can't say that that would be true for everybody, except I just believe the reorientation every day back to the center of who and whose we are, and just the time to let all of the noise fall away. To me, it has been life-changing. Now, I might need to do that multiple times a day. It's not a magic, set it for the day and it just happens all day. But there is something for me about sitting in that silence and recognizing that I don't have to offer God, and being reminded exactly who I am. Because I think a lot of, from my push in ministry, while I create things that I believe I've been called to do and called to work on and are for the good of our people, it's hard for my own identity to not get wrapped up in that and to continue to try to do more and do better and do more popular, not just so that it has a broader reach, but because it makes me feel like my work has meaning, and that can be a very hamster wheel kind of trap. And so I just find the practice of sending prayer helpful every day in the morning to just reorient as to how I want, what lens to try to do my day.
So somebody just asked a question about the name of the app, and I think I've got it right. Common Prayer, a liturgy for ordinary radicals. That's both a book and an app. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that you would say about that in terms of the kind of the functionality of that?
Well, one, I did not have enough self-discipline just to use the book. I needed the app because it sat on my shelf. And so the app, one of the things I like about the app is I can actually set the time for morning, midday, and evening prayer. So, if 7 works better for you, or 5 or 9 in the morning, whichever time when it's going to be most conducive. Some people want to do that right in the morning when they get up, and some people want to start their workday off that way. It literally takes 5 minutes to do the liturgy and pray. And so there's also something repetitive in the app. While each day has a bit different focus, there are many parts of it that repeat, which is kind of the rhythm of liturgy as well. And so, but if there's a specific question about the app, I'm happy to. Matt, when we went, Jeannie, when we went and visited Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove at, I can't think of the name of their community in Durham.
The house.
The house, yeah. We were there for one of their times of communal prayer. I believe it was evening prayer. And this very much sort of mimics that, or designed much like that. And so, it also reminds me that there are other people using this app. And so there is this sort of communion of things sort of feel to it when I engage it when the notification goes off. There are people around the world praying at the same time. There are monks at St. John's Abbey who are praying liturgy differently, but it connects me to a bigger community, even though I'm by myself.
So we're getting a little bit of strange sound feedback real quick. It's like somebody's got their phone or something like that. I don't know what that is, but anyway, neither here nor there. Just acknowledging it so everybody knows that we all hear it. Jayne, books that you've read that have been helpful for you in this regard?
Oh, now I'm going to draw a complete blank.
Yeah, sorry, I threw you that one out of left field. So
yeah, come back to that one. It'll come to me.
All right.
Well, I will say one.
Okay.
Sabbath as resistance. Walter Brinkman's book, Sabbath as resistance,
Okay.
really helped reshape a lot of my thinking about Sabbath and kind of productivity culture and stuff. So,
Okay. So you touched on this a little bit. It seems to me that one of the challenges for those of us in ministry is we have to learn how we have to have a no to go along with our yes a little bit. We have to place some limits and some boundaries. What advice would you give people who are on with us today about how to set those boundaries, how to know what, let your yes be yes and your no be no as it relates to these set of practices? So
yeah. You know, I have found I've actually physically had to block off time on my calendar to keep myself from scheduling something over that. And now we all know there are times where stuff happens and we need to lean in. But I think Greg talked about this last week, you know, of trying to widely let his folks know that Friday was his Sabbath day, his day of rest. And, you know, while that doesn't always happen perfectly for him, and that there are a lot of ministerial functions that will end up on a Friday, the more you can both model that you set that time for folks and say it out loud so that folks will actually start to hold you accountable. Well, I thought Friday was your Sabbath day. But just marking those things, I mean, even for me, marking, you know, there has to be a block of white space on my calendar for I know I won't have the time to recenter myself or the ability.
So Guy Sales asked a question about walking. So I'm just going to read his question. Any thoughts about how we might build seasons of walking into the pressed accelerator culture of most congregations? Declutter somewhat the calendar during Lent, or at least part of it on a Sabbath week or two in the year. You know, what would you say in terms of incorporating the discipline of walking into the rhythms of the church?
I love that. A couple of random thoughts. I love the idea of the Lenten calendar. We've had a couple Walk with God groups that would meet when we had our Wednesday night classes. They would meet as a group and physically walk together. They prayed for things. Because walking is something that a lot of people are already doing. So finding some way to do it alone together or then putting groups together, I think is a great way to have a theme or question to ponder. That when I was on my sabbatical, the week that I was doing the walk on the Via, we had various groups in our congregation each day that were walking with me. That was the theme, walk with me. And so, you know, creating opportunities. I do like your thought about in particular seasons, because I think that helps to create a more sense of folks coming together to do that.
Yeah, for those, so the idea of pilgrimage and the idea of these walks was not something that this is a relatively new discovery for me. And Jayne, how far back would you date your awareness of the Via and like the Camino? Like how far back, do you remember when that first kind of came into your consciousness?
Probably about 7-8 years ago.
Yeah, same for me. And I'm not sure what that is, but it does seem like sometime about a decade ago, all of a sudden, this started to be a conversation that people were having. The Camino's ancient. It's been around for a long time. Via is ancient. It's been around for a long time. And yet it's made its way into North American Protestant Christianity all of a sudden. And I don't quite know what to make of that. Maybe you know what to make of that, Jayne. And if you do, feel free to offer that wisdom or insight. I, though, try to pay attention when something like this starts to happen, when there's a convergence around an idea or a practice. I think that is speaking to a hunger that is finding, that is expressing itself. Is that your take on it, Jayne? Is that why you think why the conversations, they're not widespread yet, but why more and more people are thinking about it, thinking about traveling and doing it?
Yeah, I think particularly with the Camino has a very communal aspect to it. There's a lot more traveling in groups and lodging and eating in groups along the way. And so people come back and share their experience. It reminds me a lot, when, and people still do walks to Emmaus walks, but, there was kind of a search of that for a while. And, people come back and share about what was meaningful, and that kind of builds on itself. It's the similar phenomenon, although not a religious one particularly, but, people who walk the Appalachian Trail, there's this sense of challenge to it. There's a sense of testing your own limits of really, we do a spiritual formation hike each year that's only a section, about a 15-mile section, but nonetheless, for those of us who are not avid hikers, it's a stretch, and it's an experience that causes you to let go of your own ability to control, of needing to really consciously think about your reliance on God in this moment and being aware of your surroundings. And so I think there's a lot that just takes us out of our routine and is very appealing and effective that way.
You may have mentioned it, but just in case for those who are not familiar, you talked about Via in Italy. Camino de Santiago is in Spain and is a historical pilgrimage route. And so lots of literature out there, lots of websites, lots of books out there, both sacred and secular people who have done the walk and the lessons that they've learned. So that's a new word or phrase for you or idea for you. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about Camino.
There's also one that's very popular right now, the Way of St. Francis, which I will confess that was the one I thought I was planning for until I realized my route didn't even go to the CC, and I thought something is wrong here, and I found that I was planning on Via. So, but it was one of the two. But like Julie Phoenix and Russell, I was on Sabbatical. There's also a book by Mark Buchanan called God Walk, Moving at the Speed of Your Soul.
Yeah. Buchanan has several books on Sabbath that are around those that are really rich and wonderful. He has a book called The Rest of God, which is another wonderful book. So,
and this one is particularly, he's taken up the spiritual practice of walking. And that's what he talks about.
I didn't want to get away without acknowledging Deborah Wright put in the chat feature that there's a group of churches in Oregon that is creating a West Coast Camino with churches as hostels. So Deborah, I don't know if you want to unmute or put in the chat feature about how soon that's coming. But that's a wonderful, wonderful idea and a wonderful, wonderful place to walk. So thank you for that, Deborah.
I'm not sure how soon it'll be started, but it's a series of small, fragile churches that decided together to go this route in terms of a spiritual practice. And I'll let you know when it's sort of fully launched.
That's awesome. Thanks, Deborah. So my thanks to Jayne Davis for leading us today, rich and deep, as always, Jayne. Let me talk a little bit about what's coming next. So our theme for the next 3 weeks is called Future Forward Ministries, 3 different kind of answers to the question, what are some leading edge ministries that are just emerging that might be of blessing for congregations. Next week, my friend and colleague Michelle Snyder We'll be talking about a wonderful ministry called Soul Shop, which is suicide prevention training that is aimed primarily at congregations. On November 10th, Olu Brown, author of Normalizing Next, and was a lead pastor in the Center Point neighborhood, the East Point neighborhood in Atlanta, which at one point was one of the 25 fastest growing Methodist congregations in the United States. So we're going to have a conversation with Olu Brown. And then last but not least, Kenda Dean, who is a UMC pastor and also a professor of youth, church, and culture at Princeton Seminary, will be leading us on November the 17th. So we'd be delighted to have you back for that series. Thanks for being with us today, and hope everybody has a great week.